So the first episode of Chainsaw Man aired, and oh boy did it look good. Although that's not much of a surprise for anyone with working eyes. Like seriously, are you surprised? Cause you shouldn't be. Let's break down the visuals. We'll go over and talk about the different elements of the visuals, that being the storyboards, the animation, the CGI, the art direction and the compositing in that order. Before we start breaking down the visuals, let's briefly go over the staff. The episode was directed and storyboarded by Ryu Nakayama. Kazutaka Sugiyama served as the animation director, while Yusuke Takeda was the art director for the episode, and Teppei Ito was the director of photography. I have gone over all of these names and their previous works in a different video. Kazumasa Yokokawa, who modeled and set up the CGI in episode 80 of Attack on Titan, was the CGI director, along with Motoyo Kuno, who was the CGI director for Attack on Titan Season 4 Part 2. Let's now move on to the actual animators. Both the directors Ryu Nakayama and Tatsuya Yoshihara, as well as the animation director Kazutaka Sugiyama, animated for this episode. Besides them, names such as Keisuke Kobayashi, Ken Yamamoto, Koki Fujimoto, and more also lended their animation prowess for this episode. It's one hell of a staff to say the least. I won't be breaking down the opening, just know that it looked unbelievably good. Let's finally break down the actual episode, starting with the storyboards. It was common knowledge that Chainsaw Man will not be storyboarded like your average action anime. The staff will take a more cinematic approach, and Ryu Nakayama, the man responsible for the storyboards this episode, nailed it to perfection. The shots were framed to resemble film. The amazing first-person shot the episode opens up with, the tilted look from outside the window, this absurdly good looking overhead shot with top-notch perspective on the trees, you name it. I can say something good about every single shot in this episode. Not a single scene felt normal. It had that extra bit of creativity and effort to it. If this was a live action film, the camera would be placed at certain locations for some of the shots, and the storyboard tries to replicate those camera placements and succeeds at it. Nearly every frame is drawn at a position or at an angle that you wouldn't normally see in an anime. As for the action scenes, the storyboarding was still very unique, taking complete advantage of the CGI set pieces, which allowed for some top-notch camera work. We'll talk more about that when we get to the animation part of the video. But the storyboards were just so well done. This shot, for example, showing the zombies catching up with Denji is so well structured and gets the tension across. Again, I can extensively talk about every single scene because the storyboarding was consistently top tier, but the video would end up being half a day long. But this is the most professional looking storyboards I have seen from an anime in a long time. They were unique, dynamic, and just all around really creative. Let's move on to the actual animation, or to be more precise, just the 2D aspect. We'll talk more about the CGI shortly after, but it's a no-brainer that the animation looked phenomenal. Just look at all those names attached to this episode. But thankfully, it's not one of those shows that just animates the action well. The character acting was, in my opinion, the star of the show. From incredible walk cycles to some almost disturbingly lifelike character acting, this episode had it all. The character acting included multiple Sota Yamazaki cuts as well as cuts from Keisuke Kobayashi and Takuya Ninuma. Keep in mind that I'm not completely sure about some of these credits as it hasn't been long since the episode came out. Also notice the sheer amount of detail that the animation seems to have. The outfits are so well drawn with a ton of folds and shading on them, which makes the character acting and the movement during the same all the more impressive. This cut of Denji running and the sheer weight behind it is so well conveyed. The character acting was truly the star of the show. But let's also mention the effects animation, which looked really good as well. If I had to guess, I'd say Koki Fujimoto and Tatsuya Yoshihara did some of them. Noteworthy action cuts includes Denji being flung across the room, which starts with some gorgeous smears and perfect timing on this tentacle thing that wraps around Denji, followed by a barrage of smears and effects to get the high speed of this scene across. The devil throwing the zombies at Denji looked really impressive as well, mostly thanks to the smears. There are many more, some of which we'll discuss in the next section, but regardless of how good the action animation was, the character acting was still superior looking. Let's now talk about the CGI, the big bad evil, the boogeyman of anime visuals. There's our critical lingo, never doing that again. This was one of the aspects I was looking forward to the most. Yes, the 2D animation would look great, everybody knew that, it's predictable, but how will the CGI look? How will it be utilized? Very well, apparently. I'm happy to report that the CGI was pretty good. Of course, there were scenes where it was fairly obvious that the foreground was CGI, but I'd say the intention wasn't necessarily to hide it in the first place. CGI adds this uncanny vibe which a character with a chainsaw sticking out of his head can definitely use. The model itself was fairly good looking with a decent amount of detail and no noticeable compression at any point. I'm not going to pretend that every shot that featured CGI Denji looked natural. Some cuts did come off as awkward, some of it works in the show's favor as the uncanny style isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there was a moment or two where I would have preferred a hand-drawn cut instead. But at the same time, there were some gorgeous shots that featured a CGI version of Denji as well. The CGI model also had a lot of smears, which is really really impressive. The episode also featured many 3D backgrounds, all of which looked top notch. They added a lot to the cinematic aesthetic of the series. They featured a high frame rate and flowed really well. The textures on them were really good too. The 3D backgrounds coupled with CGI Denji led to this amazingly fast moving action sequence with really good camera placement and movement. We talked about the 2D and 3D aspects of the visuals. Let's briefly talk about how both those dimensions blended together. The action scenes in this episode featured the blending of a CGI Denji, hand-drawn zombies, a 3D background, and both digital and hand-drawn effects. It seemed to me that Denji swapped between CGI and 2D at times, but I'm not even going to attempt at distinguishing between the two. The model had smears, as I mentioned earlier, which allowed it to blend in and flow a bit better. The CGI overall wasn't perfect, but it was definitely really solid. Then we have the art direction and compositing. Both these aspects are often lacking in shows produced by Studio Mappa, and this is probably the best compositing and art direction that I have seen from a recent Mappa show. The lighting was amazing, the backgrounds looked and moved incredibly well and had good textures on them. The compositing didn't have that standard blurring issue. It also played its part in disguising the CGI with well-timed blurs and some digital smear effects. It was perfect all around. Seriously, if this is the quality of the compositing and the art direction throughout the series, it will elevate the whole thing a lot. Let's also briefly mention the all-around aesthetic of the episode. Every aspect we discussed up until this point, as well as the soundtrack, collectively creates this surreal, brutal, and tragic vibe that the first episode really needed. The fact that there's no censorship helps as well. I know this is a visual breakdown, but let me just say this, the soundtrack was incredible. Just an all-around excellent presentation. This episode looked phenomenal. It's a passion project and it shows. The sheer amount of effort and creativity put into each and every scene is really refreshing to see, as that's not something you'll find in most other modern shows. It was really sad to see a certain group of people hating on the visuals based on a 20-second long 144p leaked clip, despite the fact that you couldn't even make out what was happening in said clip. I hope Chainsaw Man will be a huge step towards getting rid of the lay CGI bad mentality that most anime fans seem to have. I won't be making a breakdown for every episode as that's simply not possible, but if any other episode ends up looking significantly better than this one, I might make another one of these. So that was it. What do you think about this episode? Comment down below. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and until next time.